Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you here. Thank you for joining us today at the IBF CACS Connect, jointly organized with the Bank of Singapore. I'm Hui Min from the IBF Standards Accreditation and Certification team. Today's theme is a very exciting one. I believe all of you can agree that sustainable finance is a very fast-growing segment. Increasingly, there is growing public interest in sustainability agenda from investors and consumers who are expecting commitment to these agendas. The evolving industry and regulatory trends are also driving companies to develop new strategies against their sustainability agendas. And therefore, there is a need for financial institutions to have talents that can support these shifts. To address these skills needs, IBF and MAS have launched a set of 12 technical skills and competencies in February this year that covers a range of thematic and functional knowledge and skills that's pertinent for sustainable finance roles and related functions. The thematic topics include climate change policy developments, natural capital, taxonomies, carbon markets, and decarbonization strategies. The functional knowledge topics cover the application of sustainability across major functions in the financial sector, such as sustainable investment management, sustainability risk management and reporting, and sustainable insurance and reinsurance solutions. IBF has recognized several programs in sustainable investment, risk management, and climate change. We strongly encourage professionals and financial institutions tap on these IBF-supported courses to upskill and deepen competencies in these areas. Also, as a quick update, the Private Banking Industry Group Sustainable Finance Task Force, comprising several key private banks, including the Bank of Singapore, have done a comprehensive review to identify the relevant sustainable finance skills applicable to the private banking industry. More details will be announced in coming months. For now, without further ado, let me pass my time over to Mr. Zubin Gabru, Market Head and Sustainability Forum Chair, Bank of Singapore, to introduce you the great lineup of speakers we have today. Over to you, Mr. Zubin.
Thank you, Hui Min. I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate IBF for getting restarted with the CACS Connect series. And we'd like to thank you and the team for inviting Bank of Singapore to co-host the first of the series. And on behalf of IBF and BOS, we'd like to welcome all online participants as we look to piece together an end-to-end view of sustainable investments. We want to keep this as interactive as possible, and should you have any questions or observations, please feel free to keep them coming at the Q&A section on your screens, and we'll try to address as many as we can. To start with, it's useful to understand some of the mega trends fundamentally changing our region. There's rapid urbanization, leading to more waste and CO2 emissions. There's rising inequality, which causes stress on resources. And of course, there's climate change. Let's piece these together and look at food demand as an example. By some estimates, food demand is expected to increase 30% by 2030 alone. On the other hand, Asian economies are more exposed than ever before on food security and inflation, given recent disruptions. The challenge is that if we don't do enough, climate change-induced economic losses in Southeast Asia alone could mount to about $28 trillion in the next half century. Now, these very challenges also suggest opportunities. Asia's next-gen leaders have recognized this and are driving a shift in mindset and capital allocation towards responsible investing. The ecosystem in our region has started working on opportunities on smart city innovations, on food security, Singapore's 30 by 30 being an example, digital supply chains, alternate energy, carbon trading. As private banks, our core business activities of wealth management can be a lever for positive environmental and social impact. And our sustainability strategies need to be aligned to meet these ASEAN megatrends. But even then, the opportunities and challenges are too huge And no single entity, however large, can be quick enough or complete enough for their clients if they choose to solve this alone. Today's IBF CACS Connect series is our approach to come together as an ecosystem as we look to share our best practices and solve together for our stakeholders. To effectively portray this integrated approach, we have two panels. For the first panel, we have invited EY to share their experiences on the opportunities as well as the challenges for sustainable investing in our region. The second panel will be moderated by Cynthia Lai, BOS Head of Managed Investments. Cynthia will be joined by representatives from Mirova and Wellington Fund Management, who she will introduce shortly. This panel will focus on ESG products for purpose in the current context. And on this note, I'm delighted to introduce EY, represented by Brian Thung, Managing Partner, Financial Services ASEAN. Brian, hi, and thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Zubin.
Brian, we'd like to get your perspective on the scope of sustainable investment seen here in Singapore and in Asia. What are the opportunities or challenges investors and business owners are looking to address?
Well, thank you, Zubin, again, and a big thank you to IBF, and a good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to speak on a topic that is of such great importance to us all. Firstly, looking at Bloomberg data, we are expecting the global market for sustainable investments to top, if I'm not wrong, 41 trillion by the end of this year. And therefore, across our markets in Asia Pac and Singapore, we are clearly seeing a diverse range of different investment and opportunities that are branded as sustainable. As such, it is important for investors to have clarity on exactly how they define sustainability in an investment context. That is, what makes up sustainable investments or responsible investments or net zero investments, green funds, and so on. So just from the listing that I mentioned earlier, there are some challenges around nailing what are sustainable investments. In fact, per data derived from a recent Fidelity survey, if I'm not wrong, 46% of APAC investors hold the view that the definition of sustainable investing seems, in their words, subjective. And there is a current lack of clear definitions for investment managers to follow. So to address your question, Zubin, let's start with the wider perspective of responsible investing. And here to help, I'd like to flash an infographic from the BOS and EY's joint publication titled Sustainability Made Simple. And here we would like to highlight some different investment approaches that we see in the market. From the table that I'm sure you can see on the screen, we try to broadly classify investors into three categories. The first one, which are those towards the left-hand side, investors who invest without ESG consideration, who are purely focused on return on capital invested. I think if you move towards the middle of the screen, in the second part, there are those investors who consider ESG as a risk to be managed. For example, investors using negative screening or ESG integration to assess risk. And finally, and we have those towards the right-hand side, and these are the investors I like to particularly call attention to. These are investors who focus on sustainability by looking to investment strategies such as positive screening, sustainability themed investments, and also impact investments to create positive value for themselves and our planet. So to bring it into Singapore and the Asia Pacific context, we do see the majority of asset managers, banks, insurance companies already consider environmental climate change aspects of risk that must be addressed. And we have increasingly encountered investors and business owners who want to focus on the opportunities that ESG present. This is borne out again when we speak with our clients, and adding to that, again, reference to the Fidelity survey, more than 60% of retail investors in our region now recognize the importance of including sustainable investing in their strategies. So with that, if I can hand it back to you again, Zubin, perhaps you can share how you are seeing responsible investing gaining traction among Asian investors, and perhaps when it comes to sustainable investment products and solutions, what are Asian investors and your private banking clients looking for?
Well, thanks, Brian. You're right, the last few years have indeed accelerated the conversations for many investors around the importance of ESG investing or sustainable investing or responsible investing, the many terms you've used. And yet the pace of growth is still piecemeal. And there are a few reasons why. Investors are either not sufficiently aware of opportunities. When they're made aware, they often find a lack of data, or worse, find different ESG scoring systems which are inconsistent, which makes it confusing for them. And I think, as you mentioned, there's a lack of consistency or approach or even language amongst different industry players. And finally, the claim that responsible investing will incentivize financial performance, that's still suspect. In the backdrop of these challenges, one key mega trend we're seeing is the great wealth transfer in our part of the world, and the fact that next-gen clients are clearly more interested in integrating ESG into their investment criteria. You mentioned different surveys. We recently conducted a survey amongst our own next-gen clients, and 2 out of every 3 responses indicated ESG goals within their investment criteria. And even amongst those who were more return-oriented, almost 1 in 3 still wanted a degree of ESG incorporated into their investment philosophy. So all this clearly indicates that sustainable investing has ample room of growth in Asia. And what Asian investors need from their advisors is a common language or taxonomy, more transparent information, and as you mentioned, more reliable data. With regard to your question on products and solutions, we feel it is not sufficient to make do with a few ESG themed products on your shelves. What the next gen is clearly asking us is to integrate an ESG lens into mainstream investment approach. By now, it is natural for us to understand the risk profiling of our clients. Going ahead, more banks will need to understand the ESG profiling of their clients and their specific preferences on E, S, or G considerations. Also, exclusions they may wish to safeguard. And finally, Brian, we'll all need to make growing investments to ensure that our bankers have the tools to track and monitor that their clients' investment portfolios do indeed reflect their individual ESG profiles.
You know, Zubin, those are, all great points. And if I can just build a bit on what you just said there, I want to highlight maybe a few things that I see as critical for investors to consider. It's important to remember that as a global investment community, we are all on a journey towards achieving a coherent response to sustainability. As part of this endeavor, it is expected that different parties, different organizations will have divergent expectations depending on their position in that journey. So I'd like to encourage investors and businesses to take certain key actions. First, engage your stakeholders. Make sure we understand their expectations. And in such cases, do engage with your leadership, your employees, and other key stakeholders. Second, we should, as much as possible, align with existing international standards. This is particularly pressing given the existing divergence of reporting. And here I'd like to draw attention to the upcoming ISSB disclosure standards that aim to provide users with a comprehensive global baseline. And therefore, this should positively encourage alignment in terms of reporting, but also opportunities to accurately communicate such sustainable impact. And finally, to have proper measurement, reporting, and audits of assurance in place to evidence that outcome from the ESG project. So on that note, Zubin, I like to highlight that this cannot be achieved by businesses or organizations acting independently, but rather we need an effective ecosystem mentality to develop what is required. So perhaps can I turn it back to you to share what your thoughts are on the importance of ecosystem partnerships and how these can come together to manage the challenges that we both just discussed.
Thanks, Brian. I couldn't agree more with you on ecosystems. Being a part of the OCBC group clearly helps us at Bank of Singapore. And firstly, we seek to leverage our very strong parentage. So again, firstly, for the many private banks out there who are a part of a larger group, it would indeed make sense to leverage off that first level ecosystem to start with. But even then, no single entity or group, no matter how large they are or how well placed they are in the region, can be quick enough or complete enough for their clients if they choose to solve this alone. And what I find most refreshing about our approach is our willingness to set up these ecosystem collaborations to co-create rather than compete as we look to solve for our stakeholders. We need to help raise the level of awareness of various stakeholders. I'm delighted at the collaboration we've had with EY these past few years with our annual sustainability thought leadership intent, which between us we've ensured we've both made available beyond our immediate staff and clients. Next, as an industry, we all need to work together to cultivate a common language and agree to ensure an approach which would increase clarity and transparency to our clients. We at Bank of Singapore, representing OCBC, were privileged to co-chair an ABS task force on sustainable private banking and wealth management guidelines. We saw best practices shared by leading minds representing local and international private banks. And what I do believe is that these will be the first such guidelines, at least in our part of the world, and that the ABS guidelines will in some form indeed benefit Singapore's aim to become a hub for sustainability in the region. And finally, whilst most banks have been traditionally strong on governance, it could help to bring in ecosystem collaborations in solving for the E and S opportunities for their stakeholders. At Bank of Singapore, we collaborate with WWF Singapore on the environmental front and with Community Foundation of Singapore on social aspects. And Brian, we leverage these ecosystem partnerships to not only solve for clients, but we seek to better engage with our multiple stakeholders, as you've suggested, including our staff, our group, and our communities.
Zubin, just to echo what you said, the ecosystem approach is really critical in achieving sustainability goals for all sectors of the economy. Maybe more locally here in Singapore, we are seeing the potential of a joined up ecosystem to tackle some of the key challenges that we face. To this point, the MES is at the forefront of this pioneering process through Project Greenprint, through its key objectives, which are, and I hope I'm not forgetting the key ones. I think first one was we want to develop a vibrant green fintech ecosystem in Singapore, while at the same time scaling green fintech solutions beyond Singapore. Secondly, part of Greenprint is to drive partnerships to make connections across financial institutions, investors, green technology and solution providers, and obviously the ESG service providers and corporates. And I think third, and just as importantly, is to encourage trust in the sustainability data flows. So maybe as a further illustration, we at EY have been fortunate enough to partner SGX in the development of a key part of this ecosystem, which is the recently launched SGX ESG Genome platform. Now, this disclosure platform is designed to support companies across the ESG disclosure process. It enables listed companies to report against 27 metrics aligned with global standards and frameworks, ensuring regulatory compliance that address investor needs for consistent and comparable ESG data. So platforms such as this will continue to develop and grow to form the backbone of an effective sustainability ecosystem to equip practitioners like us with the tools that we need to make informed and impactful decisions.
Thanks, Brian. I think just to kind of summarize what you've covered so far, clearly there are challenges ahead of us, but these challenges present opportunities. It makes sense to work in an ecosystem. Clearly, responsible investment in Asia is poised for growth. Before we close this first panel, may I ask you one last question? And what do you hope will move the needle for responsible investing in the years to come?
Of course, Zubin, and I mean, from my perspective, if there's one message that I like to reinforce, that is incorporating sustainability into your business strategies and practices is no longer optional. We are all now part of a broader global journey towards achieving a sustainable future. It's important to remember there are no failures as long as you diligently execute your plan along this pathway. So how aggressively we in each organization would want to pursue sustainable investments is a choice. I think we could argue that, but acting now is a prerogative. So in concluding, if I could borrow or paraphrase what a client of mine had told me recently, in this pursuit of sustainable investing, so long as we are empowered by capital and inspired by purpose, then I'm sure we will achieve significant positive change here in Singapore and globally.
Thank you, Brian. And on that very inspiring, optimistic note, I'd like to close our first panel discussions. I've started seeing a couple of questions coming into the Q&A for online participants. I'd encourage you to keep your questions coming. Please feel free to raise them in the Q&A section, and let's look to address them at the end of the second panel. And I would now like to hand over to Cynthia, our Head of Managed Investments, who will moderate the next panel. Cynthia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Zubin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cynthia Lim, Head of Managed Investments for Bank of Singapore. So we've heard from the earlier panel on the challenges and opportunities in Asia on sustainable investments. For this panel, we will discuss how companies across both the public and private sectors are delivering impact, the challenges they face, and how managers seek to avoid greenwashing. I'm joined by Nicholas Hayen, Investment Director and Head of Mirova in Singapore. Nicholas joined Mirova's energy transition team in 2011 and played an active role in its growth within Mirova. He covers Asia-Pacific markets for Mirova's energy transition and natural capital activities. I'm also joined by Louis Henkel, Managing Director and Lead for Wellington's Management's sustainability efforts in EMEA. She helps to set the research agenda and strategy for the firm's sustainable investment practices. Her focus is across asset classes and includes ESG research and integration, as well as impact investing. In addition to her broader sustainability work, Louis also serves as an investment director specializing in impact investing. She's a member of the firm's Impact Steering Group, as well as Sustainable Investment Global Network, and also a critical part of Wellington's Sustainable Investment Regulatory Working Group. So I'll offer the first question for the panel. How are public or private companies driving impact? Could you perhaps talk to a couple of examples of how companies are creating impact and shareholder value through their focus on sustainability? Maybe we can start with Louis.
Yes, thank you so much, Cynthia. And thank you so much for hosting this great session today. It's a great honor to be part of such an important initiative. So to your question there, Cynthia, in public markets at Wellington, we're very focused on identifying outsized investment opportunities where a company's fundamental business model is addressing a large-scale social or environmental challenge, and typically in quite differentiated and innovative ways. And this is mainly through their products and services, so where there's a strong focus on addressing an unmet social or environmental need, and very often, at least in terms of social impact, there's a focus on an underserved demographic. So that might be a low-income population, it might be elderly, it might be population in rural or remote areas. And what we often see is that tech and innovation forms the basis of many of these investment opportunities. So maybe if I could give a couple of examples. There is a good one that comes to mind in Japan. It's part of our affordable housing theme, a company called Kaititas. It's a house builder that IPO'd into public markets from private equity ownership in 2017. It has a business model that involves buying up derelict and abandoned homes and then refurbishes those into a high quality home for low income family. So their homes are actually half the price of new homes. The rule of thumb that they have is to ensure that the monthly mortgage payment is less than the equivalent for monthly rent for an equivalent home. And while I guess it might not seem like a huge revolutionary idea, it's very unusual in a market that's dominated by new builds and where houses are typically knocked down 2 or 3 decades after having been built, but through the refurbishment process, they also avoid the negative environmental impacts of building new homes. So they therefore really have a very sizable opportunity by directly addressing Japan's chronic housing shortage, but also helping to revitalize local communities that are otherwise in decline in that process. I could give another one if we have time for one more.
Sure.
All right, I'll do a quick one. This one is in Indonesia, so probably very well known to many of the people attending today. It's part of our financial inclusion theme, Bank Rakyat, that is offering loans to small and to micro commercial customers, which remains the biggest cohort in Indonesia. They currently have a 50% share in microfinance in Indonesia, which is actually 4 times bigger than their next competitor. And it's an interesting opportunity because in microfinance, that is very well supported by the government initiatives in Indonesia too, where the government is pushing for an ultra microloan program to small vendors, and where Bank Rakyat is a very strong leader in dispersing the majority of the funds there. So perhaps those are 2 examples that sort of highlight how we think about impact in public markets.
Thank you, Louise and Nicholas. How are private companies driving impact in private markets?
Thank you, Cynthia, for the question, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be there to participate to this panel. So if we focus on private market investment, what we're doing at Mirova is basically we invest in 2 large verticals. One in the energy transition sector, financing renewable energy project, low carbon mobility transportation. And the other one is what we call natural capital, namely regenerative agriculture or sustainable forestry, conservation of forest. So if we look at these 2 verticals, the project implemented by the company we finance are real asset development. So it's actual wind farms, solar plants, it's planting new trees in the soil. So you need to have developers in place who are developing this project, complex project, talking with local communities, doing the procurement of the material needed, handling the construction and the operation of these real assets. Therefore, I believe these drivers of impact are actually being implemented by this private company, and it's very real. Some of them are supporting the decarbonization of the energy sector, like when you replace a coal plant by a wind farm, for instance, you reduce the carbon footprint of your energy sector. The other aspect is you will also need to get to a net zero world to store some carbon, because you won't be able to completely avoid any carbon emission. So that's why we're also working on investing in what we call nature-based solutions, so to capture and store some carbon in trees or the soil. So these are clear real asset example of implementation. How does it translate to shareholder value? Well, I can take one example. For instance, when we invest in a sustainable forestry project, and we have done a few of them, including in Southeast Asia, we focus on the company implementing the most sustainable practices. And you have third-party certified auditors that can give you a certification to accredit the company that you are actually developing a forestry project according to the most sustainable practices. With this certification, we have seen recently, thanks to regulation, including in Europe, we recently has prevented the import of timber coming from deforested areas. So through this certification, we have access to certain markets that we could not access if we were not a sustainable forestry plantation. And we see a clear premium for this sustainable timber compared to classic timber. So implementing sustainable practices in this example translate directly into value for the shareholder because you can sell at a premium your sustainable product.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. On private companies, based on your observations, what are some of the pressing challenges that companies face as they journey towards creating impact? And how are they dealing with the challenges?
So to start with private companies, I think what we are seeing is like implementing more sustainable practices, changing some practices that may have been occurring for a long period of time is complex and can take time. So for a company, what it means is, and typically they will require some financing to transition from one practice to another. So it's also an opportunity from an investment perspective. But for the company, it means that it needs patient and expert capital. So patient, you need long-term to let the company the time to develop and implement changes, and also expert capital because you need to be able to understand what it means to transition toward the more sustainable practices. And sometimes, if I can add, understanding is not enough. You actually need to also, even as an asset manager, to support your portfolio company in implementing this transition. So you can do it by building internally some capabilities around environmental and social expertise, but also you can tap into some technical assistance facility that we have alongside our fund that we can use to provide co-financing or capacity building to some portfolio company specifically directed to implementing sustainable practices.
And Louis, on the public side, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think Nicholas touched on some really important things that are also important in public markets, especially being supportive to smaller companies as they're growing and are focused on scaling their impact footprints. Perhaps I will bring in a more topical challenge that we see at the moment in public markets and with some of our impact companies, which is how to balance operating their businesses in a very high inflation environment, and at the same time balancing this with delivering product and services to usually a very low end of the income spectrum from a consumer perspective. So, for example, one investment in the US is a national vision company. They offer their business has a strategic focus on delivering affordable vision care and glasses to lower socioeconomic demographics at low price point. They have a very broad US footprint. So they will offer an eye exam and 2 glasses for $69. They've not changed their pricing for 15 years. So they can really offer a good service at a low price point. But with the very high inflation that they're facing, that many businesses are facing now, both in US and in Europe, it's very difficult for them to now balance that inflationary pressure and not increase the prices of their products, as we see with many companies are passing on these inflationary pressure to the end consumer through increased prices. So this is why we're working very closely with a company like that to help them think through how to balance these pressures. Also for us as investors in that business, how can we help them and how should we think about balancing the impact investment, the impact we want to achieve through a potential price increase. And that's something that is really important to the engagement with the companies to understand what their strategy is in this particular space.
Thank you both, Nicholas and Louis. Maybe last question for the panel from me. There's been quite a bit of criticisms around greenwashing. As managers, how do you stay true to label and avoid companies that may not actually be sustainable or creating impact? Maybe we can start with Nicholas and Louis, you can chime in.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the question, because indeed, I think it's one of the most important for the sustainable finance space, in order to maintain confidence into this field. I see maybe three points on that. The first one being actually being able to properly assess during your own due diligence and then monitor during the investment, the period of your investment, environmental and social criteria. So that means asset manager who are responsible to allocate capital efficiently and also are also responsible to avoid greenwashing trap. Should make sure to have like in-house capabilities to do proper environmental and social due diligence. Sometimes you see in certain company, you will have one person among 200 people front office team. One person is labeled as ENS specialist. So you can wonder whether is it enough to be able to properly assess and then monitor these criteria. So I think you're first making sure you have the proper skill set in-house to do this work. Second is how this this team is involved in your decision process as an asset manager. Are they really participating from day one to your investment analysis of an opportunity? Are they sitting at your investment committee? Do they have a veto on certain decisions? So do you give actual power to this sustainability team to challenge the other front team and so make sure that this voice is heard at high level in the asset manager? And it's also a very good way to avoid some greenwashing issue if you make sure that these voices are properly heard. And I think the last one is also very important to make sure interests are aligned and incentives are also aligned. So for instance, at Mirova, we are implementing as part of our carried interest performance fee scheme, not only subject to achievement of financial target, but we're also using some impact KPI that needs to be met in order to be able to generate performance fee to the asset manager. So both financial and impact KPI. So making sure you also align with your investor, not only financially, but on the impact, achievement of impact of your portfolio.
And Louis, do you want to add on to that? You want to chime in?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I think Nicholas touched on there again that I would agree is incredibly important, particularly the due diligence. Impact investing is incredibly research intensive, not just from the perspective of the fundamental investment due diligence. It's also doing your due diligence around the impact. And we sometimes muse that it takes a village. So you do need a lot of resources. They need to be very deep into that due diligence process. I think it's really important in the selection of investments, and certainly this is something that we always think about at Wellington, is setting a really high bar for what we call impact materiality. So we typically only look for pure play companies where the impact business is the majority of what a company actually does, so we can have that strategic focus for a company. And then it's important to invest where it matters the most. So, are the investment really looking to address unmet needs? Is it focused on underserved demographics? And then one point I think is really important, which is really more about, I guess, the end investor or the end client, is it's really important for us as an asset manager that we are transparent with our clients, so our clients understand what they're investing in. I think some of these issues that we've seen around greenwashing happens because there's a mismatch of expectations. The end client thinks they're buying into something else than what they're actually ending up getting. So making sure there is a proper match of expectations and transparency, I think will help a lot with some of these issues that we see in the industry. And I think, again, also great question. So thanks for bringing it up. It's really important.
Thank you very much, Nicholas and Louis. I actually have a question from the audience here, which I think is pretty applicable for this panel as well. And the question goes, what do you have to say? I think particularly this is directed at Nicholas, to private equity managers right, who said that ESG is not applicable to its business as investments are driven by mandate guidelines and client requirements. So maybe Nicholas, you can help us to address this question.
Sorry, Cynthia, could you please repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is, what do you have to say to private equity fund managers who said that ESG is not applicable to its business as investments are driven by mandate guidelines and client requirements?
Well, I think you have two ways to see it, but one of it can also be that, and we see it with all the clients we are engaging with, for a big portion of them, ESG topics are becoming a clear concern and at the center of their attention. And it starts, our clients are mostly institutional investor, insurance company, pension fund. Themselves, their own client, people like you and me contributing to insurance, their own pension. And they see from the base, from the people, actually, this question being of interest to the clients. And therefore, it has become a clear theme to them to make sure that not only they will generate financial return with their investment, but they will also positively contribute to the society as a whole. Then I think, so it comes actually from our clients to this focus that we have, and that has been a key focus for Mirova since the beginning of Mirova. And in addition, it translates into big growth opportunity. I think in certain sectors we are addressing the energy transition, renewable energy, low carbon mobility, natural capital, all of these. These are sectors that needs to grow and grow a lot to get to net zero, which is a collective ambition following the Paris Agreement. So not only it is a need from our client, but it's also benefit from a huge growth traction from an investment perspective, because these teams are needed, and we need investment there to get to a net zero one.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So thanks again, Louis, Nicholas, for speaking with us today. It's heartening to learn that there are many companies driving impact and shareholder value across sectors, public and private markets. Generating impact, however, is pretty complex and takes quite a bit of time. So investors in impact have to be pretty patient and long-term capital allocators. So maybe before we close the session, I'll hand the session back to Zubin for the Q&A segment.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Louis and Nicholas, for a very engaging session. I'm seeing a few very interesting questions come across. So Brian, I'm going to point this one on to you. There are multiple questions around the theme of if ESG investing efficient enough to address climate change. Also, if it's efficient enough to reach net zero in Asia. Would you like to share your thoughts on, there seem to be multiple questions on the same theme.
Sure, Zubin. I also see. Sorry, I have two screens. I'm looking up and down, so apologies for that for those who are looking at me. But I did see the question. Thanks for this. I mean, look, as we discussed during our own panels, Zubin, the principle behind it is that you allocate capital in a thoughtful, impactful ways using ESG as a shaping lens, right, to inform these decisions that, in this case, for sustainable investments, what managers can achieve the meaningful impact on climate change. So ESG data is going to be critical for investing as a tool to impact these topics, perhaps as opposed to the end in it of itself, right? I think what I'm trying to drive at is that if you look at, I mean, that's why I'm coming from the principle stand basis. But if you look at what I guess respondents to surveys that are done, and I will include even the latest EY Global Investor Survey for the current year. I'm looking at my quick note here. I think based on what we have found, 91% of investors use non-financial ESG data to make decisions. Therefore, ESG data is driving large flows of capital into companies that obviously are taking heed of it. What does that mean? That means companies are taking heed of their decarbonization journey. How are they looking at their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions? How are they improving the quality and assurance of the data that they themselves are highlighting to their stakeholders? And all this should be very useful in addressing the climate change And therefore, if you again go back to our discussion, it would then reward those who are taking it seriously. So hopefully, with the various questions that had the similar tone of it, Zubin, I hope that will address it. I don't know whether our fund managers here got any comments to make, but I think that's where, at least from our global survey, that we thought, clearly 91% of investors is a majority.
No, I'm going to pass this back to our fund managers, and I also see some more targeted questions for them. So, Luis and Nicholas, if you'd like to add on that, and also the questions which we are seeing is, at your end, are you seeing an increase in demand from investors in sustainable investments here in Singapore and Asia? What's the state of readiness in Asia compared to, say, Europe? If any thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe if I could just maybe jump in with a couple of comments also on Brian's point there to how we can make it more efficient, especially with the climate investments. And I think there's actually a really good opportunity to think about your strategic asset allocation through a climate lens, and think about how you can do a net zero path for maybe your core parts of your portfolio, and where it is there is enough data available that you can understand how to incorporate this into your portfolio construction. And then at the same time, combine this with investments in what I would call green solutions. So that might be new technology, environmental technology, climate tech, but it could also be thought of as a climate resilience, climate adaptation, not just mitigation. And so those investments could sit around the core portfolio that is being decarbonized. So I think there's a very interesting lens that we're looking to develop much further at Wellington, where we think about strategic asset allocation through that climate lens.
And if I can contribute to the second question, Zubin, and thank you for that, on the interest of investor in Asia. So historically, Mirova, we are European-based asset manager. Most of our investor base has been in Europe and North America. However, we are seeing a clear peak of interest from Asian clients around our ESG solution. The level of interest is definitely not the same as in Europe, but still it's picking up. We see some investor in Japan, in Korea, institutional investors starting to have dedicated ESG impact allocation towards energy transition, natural capital strategy. This is new, I think, so it's gaining some traction. An interesting development we see also as an asset manager is the involvement directly of corporate, not only institutional investor. We are at Mirova working with other corporates. Some are public, like we have some mandate we manage on behalf of the French corporate L'Oréal, for instance. These corporates have all issued net zero, ambitious plan to become net zero under a certain timeline. And we are working with them to potentially invest on their behalf in project generating carbon credit, nature-based solution generating carbon credit, that we distribute in kind to this corporate, and this carbon credit will contribute to their own net zero journey. So it's also an interesting development we are seeing from the GP angle, to have this kind of new clients interesting to invest indirectly through GP into this impactful sector.
Thanks, Nicholas. I'm seeing multiple questions around one theme, and I'm going to throw this to each of you away. Are we seeing clients here in Asia still more return oriented, or are you seeing a real demand for impact building up? Are clients in Asia ready for impact? There are multiple questions around this theme. Brian, maybe I could start with you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Zubin. I don't know whether do I give the cynical answer or the view. Look, I am by nature, obviously, as a still practicing chartered accountant and auditor, I'm always trained to look at skepticism. But to be fair, it is very, as we discussed, right? This is a key point in time. And I think investors, while they clearly are, and I guess that the asset owners, let me put it that way, and therefore investors, they definitely have a KPI on making sure that the assets that they would allocate, and they put the KPIs on managers to have, the returns. But there's clearly an ability to look at the key underlying data. I think Luis said it really well earlier. If those data are very measurable and they're able to translate into, again, the right monitoring mechanism and again to understand the impact to it, I think asset allocators, asset owners would want to definitely be involved in this, and while at the same time having certain stringent requirements on the returns. So maybe if I twist that point a bit, and I won't take much time, Zubin, I just say that so the question is that how do we check this? How do we align this? And I think the point that we made earlier about international standards, right? I think that's quite key. That helps to be able to allow the baseline, right? The global baseline, what is then acceptable? What would be the kind of things, disclosures would be required such that the comparability can be determined, and then further more specific questions can come through, right? So standards and legislation such as ISB and the SFDR, I think these are pretty good yardsticks that allow companies in Asia to remain in step with global competitors in relation to the point that you're making.
Thanks, Brian. Luis, would you like to take that too?
Maybe just a comment on the return point, the total return orientation and return expectations. And I think we've been through, we're going through a phase where it's a bit of a multi-speed world, right? Every part of the world is sort of on a different stage of their journey and how they're embracing, or in some cases not embracing, sustainable investments. And I think it's really important to see the educational process that we at Wellington have been through with many of our clients in Europe. We are not discussing the return versus the impact, perceived trade-off so much anymore. We did that maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but I think it's generally understood now that actually this can be a really great investment opportunity. And you don't have to have a trade-off between the impact that you deliver and the return that you deliver. So maybe it's a slightly different take on the question there, but of course, depending on the asset class and whether it's public or private markets, the return profiles will differ. And one could build a really interesting portfolio across the whole ecosystem of different asset classes. Maybe that's private equity, maybe it's private credit combined with public equity for a more liquid part of the portfolio, and really achieve sustainability in a total portfolio activation way across every asset class. I think that should be the goal for those asset owners who are really understanding the different asset classes and who want to deliver impact or sustainability across their whole investment portfolio. Slightly different take on the question.
Indeed. Thanks, Luis. I'm seeing 2 more questions, and I'm going to just try and wrap it there in the interest of time. One, and we've seen a few repeat questions, and I've had a separate side chat with Brian, and I have his okay on this. We've had questions asking if we can share the sustainability report Brian mentioned and what we kind of covered, we'd made available beyond our clients. So if that's okay, then if somebody can kind of help us put maybe, yep, okay. So the sustainability report, here's the report, the QR code for the reports, for those of you all who were interested. And lastly, whilst those who are interested take the QR code here, I'm going to have that last one question before we wrap up. And this is going to be a quick short one from each of you all. If there's just one strong advice you want to give to the many wealth managers here to be better prepared for their clients in their sustainability journey, what's it going to be? Nicholas.
Well, I think, and it's also seconding what Louise mentioned just before, it's very important to highlight that today we don't have to trade off impact versus return. Like some sectors that are supporting our impact and our transition to our more sustainability are seeing a huge growth in around climate biodiversity. So you can actually do good and earn good as well. So it's an important message, I guess, to share. And you have fund with track record that can demonstrate that.
Thanks, Nicholas. Brian, would you like to take that next?
Hey, Zubin, yeah, sure. I mean, maybe just to reiterate the point that you kind of asked me towards the end of our panel, I think really it's about the tone at the top with the boards, right? Incorporating the sustainability in the overall strategy and practices is very key. But then again, as I said, if we do it diligently, we execute the plan that the organization has along its pathway, then there should be no failures. That means they're doing what they can. They're looking at all the measurements that they believe are key in terms of their decarbonization journey. So I think that's the mentality to have, right? Execute as well as they can and stay on that pathway.
Thank you. Luis?
Yes, maybe a short point here, which is, I think as everyone goes about their sustainability journey, it's important to recognize that there isn't one size that fits all. And it's, I think, for thinking about how asset owners can implement their own sustainability programs, I think it's important to have building blocks, maybe different asset classes, again, as I alluded to, so asset owners can have as much choice and as many building blocks in implementing their own sustainability programs. And it's really important to have a thoughtful approach to how you go about this. So to think about the investor, the portfolio manager, and their investment belief, their investment philosophy, how can you integrate that in a way that's really authentic and is intrinsically aligned with their investment beliefs when they make sustainable investments? Because the two needs to be married together. You can't bolt one onto the other. It has to be embedded in the approach.
Thanks, Luis. All very useful. Cynthia, the last word from you before we wrap up.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
If there's one piece of advice you had for the wealth advisors to be better positioned for their clients on sustainable investments, what would it be?
In terms of advice, I think definitely we need to prepare a lot more in terms of education, getting them up to speed in terms of understanding, the implications of including sustainability factors and understanding the inclusion of sustainability and what that means, from the company's operating leverage, revenue and profits perspective. I think today there's not a lot of education that goes around that to help people to materially understand with real case studies as to how that is happening. Certainly, as we build up the education on that, I think there can be a lot more emphasis on that.
Thank you, Cynthia. So more education, increasing awareness, integrating it, tone from the top, all very useful inputs, and thank you for that. So this has clearly been a very strong start to our inaugural CACS Connect series restarted by IBF. And we hope it's been useful to piece together an end-to-end view on sustainable investments as we wanted to at the start of the session. I think we covered key trends, the challenges, the opportunities, the scope for growth, what needs to be done to solve for clients, and in doing so, to capture the various opportunities or the potential for industry players like ourselves. I think Brian also covered the scope and spectrum of sustainable investments from return-oriented to impact-oriented, why ecosystem collaborations are key, why stakeholder engagement is key. So with all that, I want to thank our guests, Nicholas, I want to thank Luis, I want to thank you, Brian, for taking the time to share your experiences with us today. Thanks, Cynthia and Huimin and the teams at IBF and BOS. And last but not the least, thank you for our over 200 participants who joined us for today's session. We wish you all the best in your journey on sustainability going forward, and I wish each of you to be the change makers to help drive this with the speed it needs here in Singapore and Asia going forward. I think we are closing at the dot of time, so well done to all of you all for kind of keeping to the time limit, and good evening and good luck to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. With that, we'll wrap up.
Thank you once again, speakers, for sharing your insights. I'm sure all the audience has benefited very much from your insights. So we have now come to the end of today's session. Thank you once again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next run. You may stay connected with us via LinkedIn or via our website by scanning these QR codes. Thank you once again, everyone, and have a very good afternoon.